been looking at the diseases of wildlife, but let's try to see where now this wildlife, for example, could be found. So in this case, we look at two environments. So wildlife in deserts and wildlife in forest environments. Okay, and both of these we look at them from a point of view of them being ecosystems. So an ecosystem is a place where living things, which are like plants or animals, interact with each other. So living things interact with each other and their surrounding. So the surrounding could be things that are like soil, water, or even the sunlight. So everything in an ecosystem depends on one another to survive, which means the living things in the ecosystem depend on other living things and even other non-living things. So within any ecosystem, you then have living things, which we call the biotic factors, and the non-living things, which we refer to as the abiotic factors. So let's now zero in into the desert environments. So deserts, these are actually vast, dry landscapes that receive very little rainfall. Okay? So because of the little rainfall, they will end up having very harsh conditions. But even in the face of these harsh conditions, these deserts are still home to a variety of plants and animals. So remember, these deserts have very harsh conditions, but still there are animals and plants which will still be adapted in a special way to survive in very hot and in a very hot environment with very little water. And mostly the soils that are found in deserts are very poor in nutrients. So the deserts are characterized, as we've indicated, as being dry places with very little rain. And during the day, these ecosystems are hot, but at night they are colder. Okay. So because of these harsh conditions, we find that only a few plants and animals can actually survive. And for them to survive, these animals and plants should have some special features that give them that ability to live in the very scarce water and extreme temperatures. During the day is hot and at night is fairly colder. Often the soil across the desert is largely sandy and rocky. And now because of that, you find that vegetation is very sparse. Yani inapatikana hapa, pale, because the soil is not fertile. So we've given examples of the desert environments, the Chalbi Desert and the Turkana region. Okay. But the animals that you find within these desert environments, you find camels, which are known as sheep of the desert. So camels can survive for days without water. They store fat in their humps, and this fat will give them energy whenever food is scarce. You have the gravy zebras. These are rare zebras that live in dry areas. These gravy zebras are able to eat tough grass that other animals avoid. Then they have stripes on their body. These stripes helps in the reflecting the sun's heat. Remember, the sun in the desert is very hot. Then you have the oryx, the Beza oryx. These are large antelope which can live without drinking water for a long period. So it gets moisture from the plants that it eats. Okay. Then we have other examples like the gerenuk. This is a long-necked antelope that is able to stand on its hind legs so that it can reach leaves on the tall shrubs. There is another bird that flies for long distances to find water. Then once it finds water, it can soak its feathers so that it carries water back to its chicks. This bird is the sand grouse. So you realize that most of the animals that we are finding in a desert environment, they have an ability to live in an environment with scarce food and little water and very hot temperatures. So those are the characteristics of desert animals. So what about the plants that are found in deserts? So plants in the deserts will have adaptations to help them save water and also survive the heat. So the acacia plants, for example, they have deep roots. The deep roots will help them to find underground water. But their leaves are small, which now makes them to have that ability to reduce water loss. You have the euphorbia ones, the ones that have the ability to store water in their thick and fleshy stems. All of you, I think, if not the most, will know the aloe vera. It has spiky, thick leaves. The thick leaves have the ability to store water, but the spikes, hiyo miba inapatikana hapo, is to protect the plant from being eaten by herbivores. Okay. So the key terms in this desert ecosystem, we talk of adaptations. Adaptation is a key or a special feature or behavior which helps a plant or an animal to survive in its environment. Then nocturnal, these are animals that are active at night to avoid the daytime heat. So most animals in the desert will be nocturnal because remember at night it is colder. So for them to be nocturnal, it means they will have a better eyesight at night. Then mchana, they are inactive. Then the plants which have the ability to store water in their leaves or stems, we call them succulent. So most desert plants will now be succulent. So in general, the desert wildlife is resilient. And the many species you find in the desert, each of them has an important role that it plays in the desert ecosystem so that it can be kept balanced. So in essence, most people think that deserts are seemingly empty, but actually they are full of life. There are plants and animals which are perfectly adapted or suited to that particular desert environment. So what about the forest environment? So forests are rich, dynamic ecosystems which appear to be teeming with life. Okay? So you think of forests in Kenya, then you remember the Mau Forest Complex, the Kakamega Forest, which is closer here. And these ones are vital for biodiversity because they support a wide variety of plants and animals. And these animals and plants which are found in the forest ecosystem, they have adaptations that enable them to survive and thrive in this environment. So for the forest plants, most of these plants are adapted to compete for sunlight. They also are adapted to cope with the heavy rainfall, okay? And equally interact with the various animals. So some of the characteristics which are common include trees being tall and the formation of the canopy layers. Okay. So for them to grow tall, they have to ensure that they are able to reach and access sunlight. Okay. Then the formation of a canopy, the canopy provides shade for smaller plants and even other animals. Then now you have plants which have broad and waxy leaves. Okay. So the ones that will have large leaves, the large leaves will be an adaptation to catch the limited sunlight. So most of those plants will be the ones that are found under other trees so that they maximize whenever the sunlight has percolated through to them, they can maximize with their broad leaves, they can maximize and catch enough within a very short time. The waxy coating will help to shed excess water from the heavy rains. Okay. Then we have those that are the epiphytes and the climbers. So there are some plants that will climb, use other tree trunks, ijifungafunge hapo, ili iweze kuenda juu, so that it can access sunlight. So it is a climber. On its own iwezi, but inajishika kwa mti ingine, then it wraps itself up as it grows. Then it is able now to access light. Forests also have diverse plant life. So they host different types of plants. And each of those will be playing a critical role in the ecosystem. So each of those has its own niche within that forest ecosystem. What about the forest animals? So just like the plants within the forest, animals will also be diverse, will be varied, and they come with different adaptations which enable them to navigate through the dense forest, the dense vegetation within the forest environment. So that ability to navigate is important for the animals, as it makes them to either find food or avoid predators. Okay. So there are some animals which have the arboreal adaptations. These are the adaptations that make these animals to have very strong limbs or long tails to help them in climbing or leaping from one tree to another. So there are monkeys or there are tree squirrels zenye zinaweza ruka kutoka kwa mti moja mpaka mti ingine, ama ziko na that adaptation to make them have limbs and long tails for climbing and for jumping. The tail is for balancing, okay, and jumping around the trees. There is an adaptation for camouflage and coloration. So they need to camouflage so that they cannot be easily pinpointed by predators. So camouflage and coloration helps in the avoidance of predators. Then the diversity of diets. So the plants that are many within the forest will be supporting different herbivores. Then the herbivores that are many will be relying now, will be the support for the predators. So it means the diversity in the plants is what supports a diversity of herbivores. Then the diversity in the herbivores is now what supports a diversity among the predators. Then the complex sound communication. Things like birds, they have different calls, loud calls, to communicate across the what? The dense vegetation. Insects will also have their own way of making sounds for communication with the other fellow insects within the rich forest ecosystem. Okay. So conservation concerns and efforts for wildlife within the forest. There are numerous threats that endanger both the animals and plant species that are found within this forest ecosystem. And there is therefore need that conservation efforts are put in so that we maintain the biodiversity within the forest, we conserve it, and we manage it. Okay. Conserving this biodiversity will ensure that the ecosystems remain healthy and sustainable. So the conservation concerns are about things like deforestation and habitat loss. So we have forests being cleared either for agriculture, for timber, or for human settlement. When this clearance happens, then we destroy these habitats which keep species. Okay? So we've seen the wildlife that is found within the forest. So you destroy a forest, you've destroyed a home for the particular animal or plant. The habitat fragmentation. At times, the forests are not destroyed in total, but there are sections of it which are destroyed. Then we have corridors where wildlife uses to move from one forest or one section of the forest to another. So if you fragment these forests, then you end up isolating the populations of wildlife that were moving from one region to another. And with that isolation, we now reduce genetic diversity, because when they are isolated, they no longer meet, then there cannot be gene flow. So we sort of increase incidences of genetic drift impacting on those organisms. Then with the habitat fragmentation, it now becomes even difficult for species to find food, find mates, and find shelter. Because if they are confined to just one section of the forest, then if there is no food in that section, there is nowhere else they can go. So it's difficult for them now to survive. Then there is the poaching and the illegal wildlife trade. So you have animals like elephants, rhinos being killed for their ivory, for their horns. Then the other animals where people want to eat, for example, then they are hunted down. The gazelles, okay? These are the animals that can be eaten by human beings. The hares, the squirrels. So when they are hunted down like that for eating, then we are reducing the diversity of these animals. We are killing them. Then now the climate change aspect, we have a rising temperatures, courtesy of climate change. And because of that, we've resulted in unpredictable rainfall patterns. A forest ecosystem relies on rain for it to thrive. So if we don't have rainfall patterns that are predictable, yet we have these rising temperatures, then the plant growth will be impacted. Once the available plants are reduced in any way, they are compromised, then we are affecting the food chain. So the entire ecosystem will be affected. Okay. So prolonged droughts can also destroy habitats. And once a habitat is destroyed, then resources become scarce. Now the conservation efforts. We need to create more protected areas and other national parks. Okay. So we have conservation, community conservation parks or reserves. Then we have the national parks, which are managed by the government. But now the conservation reserves are managed by communities. And that is a good effort, because with this, they now provide a safe space so that wildlife that would have otherwise been destroyed is now given somewhere where it is protected from destruction. Then the community involvement and ecotourism. Local communities can help in managing forests because they've lived there and they live in the immediate environment, unlike the governments which are far away. So the best way to do that is you can put in aspects of ecotourism so that people can come, walk around in these forests, they have a look at what nature provides within these forests. Then now the local communities can benefit from the revenue that is generated from that. We need to come up with the anti-poaching initiatives, okay? So that people don't kill livestock. People don't, and poaching is just not for wildlife, even for plants. People will go to forests and want to get the Elgon teak trees so that they can make furniture from it because it's a hardwood. So if we come up with such ways, then we ensure that the wildlife we are managing, we are conserving, will not be destroyed. Then the reforestation and habitat restoration. Let's have tree planting initiatives so that we restore forests that were degraded, the Mau. Okay. The current government efforts, watu wapande miti, so that we can grow our forests to restore the forest cover that we had. Once we have the tree cover increasing, then we'll have wild animals following. Okay? So we need to prioritize indigenous tree species, because the trees that are indigenous, for example, to this Alupe area, will have more support from the local ecosystem, from the local people, because they are attached to them. They use them possibly for even as traditional medicine. So if we plant these indigenous tree species, then we are likely to have support of the locals. Okay. Then research and monitoring. We need to have research about how species move, the health challenges, so that from the results of this movement, information we generate about how these animals are moving, how the populations are increasing or reducing, how the health of the ecosystem is doing, either are we having an increase in the numbers or a decrease in the numbers, then now conservation efforts can be put in on the basis of those results. Then policy and legislation, the government can come up with very stern measures and policies and laws to ensure that we don't destroy our natural resources, but we use them sustainably, so that we protect the species that are endangered, and we ensure that whatever we have can be used for posterity. We have climate change. So the question is it a threat to our efforts to manage natural resources? And now, what is the best way forward? Because climate change is now a reality. We cannot run away from it. So the truth is, yes, it is a threat. Climate change is a threat to the conservation and management efforts of our natural resources. But now, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this threat? Okay, how do we deal with this threat? So the best way to deal with this is coming up with climate resilient forest management. So experts recommend adoption of climate smart forestry practices, such as planting drought resistant tree species. So if we plant drought resistant tree species, it means even if there is a drought, the trees will not die, will not be affected, okay, because already they are resilient. Okay. Then we need now to create corridors for wildlife movement. Remember, we talked of fragmenting the ecosystems. So if we create corridors and we ensure that those corridors are not interfered with, then these fragmented patches of the forest will still ensure that animals that are found in those fragments can still migrate. So when they want to move from one area to another, they will still move. If there is no food, if there is a disease outbreak in one section of the forest, animals will move from one section to the other section. So we will have removed dangers that come with isolation. Okay. There is also need that we come up with community-led conservation efforts. As we indicated, there is need that we involve local communities, because these are the people who live with forests, who live, for example, the Okiek, the traditional hunter-gatherers. These are the people who lived in forests longer. These are the people who sustainably used forests. So if we involve them, then we are likely to foster long-term stewardship. So these people will be, in a way, empowered to manage these forests in a more sustainable way. So we need to involve communities and let these communities lead the way in the conservation aspects. There is need for global collaboration and funding. The effects of climate change are not restricted to a particular country or a particular region, but they affect the entire world. So it means for us to help restore the challenges that the globe is having, then the entire globe has to collaborate and fund these conservation efforts. Then we need now to have increased education and advocacy. So we raise awareness among communities on the realities of climate change and how these realities are now affecting not just forests, but even wildlife. The best example is usually by now we will have had rains, but up to now there are no rains. So it's a reality that the climate has done what? Has undergone changes. And we need to educate people on why this climate is changing. So that once they know that these are the causes of the climate change, so they will be in a position now to stop those changes, to stop those factors that are leading to climate change. Because once the factors have been stopped, then the climate change will not exacerbate. Okay. So the last bit, why is conservation important? Okay. Why are we talking about conservation? We've talked about forests, deserts, then eventually we are talking about now there is climate change, but still we need to come up with ways of conserving our natural resources. So why is it important? Why is conservation important? So when we protect both desert and forest wildlife, we are protecting the biodiversity within those ecosystems. The ecosystems produce some services. They provide services, for example, clean air, they provide water to the entire other living organisms within the forest ecosystem. Then, when you go to people who live in the deserts, who live within the forests, they have some cultural and economic benefits that they derive from those ecosystems. You ask the Kikuyus, they will tell you that their god is in Mount Kenya. So it means for them, when we conserve Mount Kenya, it is a cultural thing. Okay? You go to the Okiek, they rely on honey. Honey is one of their very important things, not only for their culture, but even economically. So it means honey is found in the forest. The bees, the beehives are put in the forests. So if we conserve the forests for the Okiek, it is an economic venture. Okay? So it means if we address the threats that put these ecosystems, the desert ecosystem, the forest ecosystem, at danger, we address the threats that endanger these ecosystems, then we expand our conservation efforts. Then come up with ways to ensure that we are adapting to this climate change. How do we do that? Come up with increased plant cover, especially of those plants that are resilient to droughts. Rare animals that are also resilient to droughts. So we begin then adapting to the climate changes. By doing that, then we ensure that the future generations will inherit ecosystems that are not only thriving, but also balanced. Okay. So we try to conserve so that we can hand over. I'm sure your parents, there is something they kept for you. So the inheritance that we will give the future generations, it should be we give to them ecosystems that are thriving, ecosystems that are balanced. How do we create those ecosystems? We need to create them through conservation. Okay? So that will mark the end of this bit on the wildlife that is found in forests and desert ecosystems, their characteristics, then the threat of climate change to these ecosystems, and how we can counter that threat, how we can put in the conservation measures, and lastly, why conservation is an important venture. Okay? So I'll stop there, and I'll see you again in the next video. Thank you so much.